Hi guys, I'm Amy and welcome to my podcast, Spill the Teeth, where I spill the tea on all things dentistry and a bunch of other fun things. Welcome to episode 5. So let's start off with what I usually start off with, which is a week in review, and we're on week 9. Can't really believe it, we're on week 9, but here we are. So if you listened or watched the last episode, you know that I'm in the thick of midterms, so a lot of this past week in review is going to be a lot of the midterms that I took, so here we go. As you know, last week I was supposed to have the RPD midterm, but unfortunately it got canceled because my school had a late start due to the snow, so the RPD practical of the practical midterm got pushed into this past week. So me and my classmates had an hour and a half to do some guide planes, reciprocal planes, and rest seats. So I thought that went pretty well. I didn't feel as good as I did after the fixed one for the prep, but I also didn't feel terrible about it, so I guess I'll have to wait and see until I get the grade back. That same day, that was on a Tuesday, I had an implantology midterm, and that was interesting just because we have different professors teaching in that class, so some of my classes have a course director, so they're the main professor teaching that course, but there are also other guest lecturers. So 2 out of the 3 guest lectures that we have been online, just due to reasons like technical reasons, and one of them was sick. So if you have guest lecturers, they usually write their own exam questions, and then that gets added to the midterm. But there were a lot of pictures that I had never seen before, and were not really, or at least in my opinion, related to their lectures at all. So that was a little bit of a surprise, but the professor ended up curving the exam, so I did pretty well. This past Thursday, I had a dental behavioral science patient interview, and this is when we interview a fake patient, and really the fake patient is a D4. The D4 was given a patient scenario, so they're instructed to act a certain way and whatever, and we have to pretend like we're interviewing them. The last midterm of this past week was on Friday, and it was the OMFS 1 final. This was actually a final because this class is only 9 weeks long, so only half the semester. So after that final, I was done with the class. And that was another interesting exam because some of the questions and answers got flipped, so it was really hard to answer some of the questions because they were not in the right order, but the professor said they realized that that happened and that they're going to fix it. This next week, so week 10, is going to be the last week that I have of school before I go to spring break. And that means I only have 3 more finals to get through. So on Monday, I have the fixed midterm. So last week, or 2 weeks as when this podcast comes out, I had the practical, which was the crown prep and the provisional crown. But on Monday, or today, because hopefully this will come out on Monday, I have the fixed midterm. And then on Wednesday, I have my last 2 midterms, which is oral med and hard tissue oral pathology. So just to let you know that I will have an episode 6, which will drop the Monday that I'm in spring break, but I will not have an episode 7 the week after because I usually record the podcast on Friday, and that Friday I'm gonna be at home, so I won't have my recording equipment, which you could say, well, you could just bring your recording equipment home, Amy, but I really don't want to, and recording a podcast takes time, and I really want to just spend that time with my family. So 7 will drop the Monday after the first week that I'm back at spring break. If that's too confusing, because it's confusing for me, don't worry about it. I'll let you know. If you want to keep up with the podcast, just check on my Instagram. I usually let y'all know that it's been uploaded there. Okay, now that I've done my week in review and also the week in advance, I'm going to do the hot and not. So the not of this week was actually the dental behavioral science patient interview, and initially I actually wasn't nervous going into this. We did a lot of practice in class and I got to practice with my friend, but the scenario that I got was that the patient was in for a treatment planning interview and had already been in the clinic because of an emergency endo situation and had not been at the clinic for several years prior to that and was now coming in and had perio and a crown planned. I don't know why, but the fact that the patient had already been in for an emergency endo situation kind of threw me for a loop, and I kind of got off track of the initial health interview outline, which was weird because I really didn't have to, since I, in the situation, was seeing the patient and doing a treatment planning interview, basically. But the D4 must have gotten the scenario to act like really annoyed or indifferent, and that kind of threw me for a loop because I have come to realize that I don't really do well with patients who have like a bad attitude or kind of indifferent, like, oh yeah, whatever, I'm here for whatever treatment, which is not good because I, as a dentist, am going to encounter a lot of those types of patients. But indifference of patients is something that you can bring up. And I think I kind of missed the mark of, I did pick up on the fact that the patient was frustrated or indifferent about the treatment, and I kind of pursued it in the beginning, but I really didn't get to the root of it until the end, so I felt like I kind of missed the mark on that. Because these interviews are recorded, that also added a level of pressure, so my interview was definitely not as smooth as I would have liked it to go. And you'd think that I'd be used to being recorded by now because I'm doing something like this, but also nobody's watching me do this. It's just me in my room alone. But walking out of that patient interview, I definitely think that I could have done better, which is not a bad thing. Obviously, since I've not treated patients on my own, I have a lot to work on, and it's a good thing that I'm working on it now in simulated situations. But I definitely think that I could have done better. The hot of this week, and no pun intended because it was actually hot this week, but the hot this week was that there were some warmer temperature days, so I was able to go out and enjoy the sun. So I'm not what you would call an outdoorsy person, but I do like sitting on like a lawn chair out in the sun, reading a book. Unfortunately, this time I was not reading a book, I was actually working on Quizlets, but one of the days I was able to sit outside in the sun, wrapped up in a blanket, and I was able to work on some Quizlets. But this past Friday, it was the high of 70, I believe, and it was sunny. So that day, I had gotten out of class early, and I had initially planned to do a lot of studying because, of course, I'm in midterms, so I had a study block planned from 3 to 5 p.m., but I decided to ditch the studying and go on a walk, which was super nice. I drove to a nearby park, and I just walked for about an hour and a half, which just goes to show you that you have to have studying breaks. And even me, who is someone who likes studying, I know, I'm weird, I also need breaks too. So now that's out of the way, let's move on to the non-dental topic of the week. And I kind of want to talk about books because this past week, the library at my school had a blind date with a book thing. So they wrapped up books in paper so you couldn't see the cover. And then they wrote a little synopsis about the book without giving it away. So you could choose a book based on the little blurb that they wrote about it and then check it out for a month. So I got this book by James Patterson and Brian Sitz, and it's called Holmes, Marple, and Poe. And of course, I didn't see the cover when I picked it out. It was just a blurb, and I think it was about detectives solving a crime, which I love murder mystery and detective novels, so this was right up my alley. So, unfortunately, I don't have time to read that book right now, but I am taking it home with me when I go on spring break, and will be reading that along with, I hope, many other books. So, when I'm not doing dentistry, I actually love to read, but I don't do a lot of it while I'm in dental school because I just don't have the time, which is not a good excuse because if you love to do something, you should definitely make the time to do it, even when you're in dental school. I attribute my love for reading to my mom because she is a very big reader. We like to joke that she has the Library of Alexandria down in our basement because she has bookshelves of books, and she's always reading, always lending books to people, and she just loves to read. So growing up, I read a lot and was read too. The first books I really remember reading when I was a kid were the Magic Treehouse books, which I'm sure a lot of people, those were their first real books too, and I'm sure there's a bunch of those books out. I'm not sure that Mary Pope Osborne is still writing them, but Jack and Annie, they were my faves. So when I was homeschooled, we had to do like book reports, so it would be the title, the author, new words that you found in the book, because my mom was really big on learning about new words, and then we had to write a synopsis of it, and then the resolution, and something that you learned from the book. So I have binders of these book reports at home, but after I stopped doing the book reports, I kind of just logged my own reading. My mom got me a notebook that is one of those book logger things where you can do, it's basically what I did doing a book report, but it was in a notebook form and you could like rate the books. And I did that for a while, but unfortunately I lost that book. So I kind of lost track of a lot of the books that I read, but I have read a ton. And I know you can do like a Goodreads book tracker or whatever, but for some reason I haven't gotten around to that, which I really should because I like to remember the books that I've read. So my favorite genres to read are historical fiction, thriller, horror, and murder mystery. My mom was really big on reading about history, so that's why I kind of read a lot of historical fiction. I have a hard time reading nonfiction things, so historical fiction made it a lot easier to learn about history, but in a way that it wasn't like textbook reading. One of the historical fiction series that I remember reading, and actually am still reading, is the Bess Crawford Mysteries, which is written by Charles Todd. And Charles Todd was actually a writing duo of a son and a mother until the mother passed away actually recently, but I believe he's still writing the book. So that series is about a nurse in World War One, and she kind of gets herself caught up in these mysteries along the way. I'm not really sure about how many books there are, but I have read all of them, and I actually started in the middle of the series. At that time, I was really into historical fiction books about nursing, and so I came across the book The Unmarked Grave, and so I read that, and then I figured out it was a series, so then I read the rest of the series. And it is still going on. I'm not sure when the next book is going to come out. I think it's in 2026 because he is also writing a different book series, but I have been waiting for a long time for this book, so that's definitely one of the only book series that I keep up to date with. As I said, I also like thriller and horror and murder mystery. I know that sounds a little disturbing. It's like those people who watch true crime, which, guilty as charged, I am one of those people, but I just like things that have a little bit of mystery of it. Obviously, murder is a great way to incorporate mystery into a book. I also like kind of the darker side of that, which is thriller, psychological thriller, or horror. I don't read a lot of horror stuff because that can go into the realm of like ghosts and like monsters and weird things. I'm more into like the disturbing horror where it's like people, but it's more psychological thriller. One of the first horror books I really remember reading was actually Stephen King's book The Outsider, and it was one of the longest books I've ever read, but I also finished it in a day because it was just that good. But other than that, I usually stay towards the thriller side instead of the horror side. My least favorite genres to read are probably romance, science fiction, and fantasy. The last fantasy series that I remember reading was the Aragon series, and that's because of my sister who was reading them at the time. For fantasy, I can't really keep track of all the characters, and I don't like things that involve magic, so I usually don't read them. I don't like the sci-fi where it's like the futuristic space stuff, but I will watch sci-fi, but I don't like reading about it. And then romance, I just find it cringy. Maybe it's because I'm not in a romantic relationship that I find it cringy, but the ones that are out nowadays, I just don't go towards because they're NSFW or not safe for work, and I just don't find the characters interesting. Despite saying that, I have read some really good romance books, and I actually have written romance because I write in my free time, but that's a story for another day. So I want to talk about some of my favorite book series, my favorite authors, things like this. And guys, this is what I like about this podcast because I can talk about the dental stuff, but I can also talk about things that I want to talk about and I find interesting, and I've always wanted to talk about books because I love reading, so this is really fun for me. So even if I'm talking into the void, thank you, Void, for listening. So for my favorite authors, I have a lot of them because Obviously, I read a lot of books, but there are some that do come to mind based on the things that I've read and the books that they've written. So one of my favorite authors is Carolyn Keene, and I know Carolyn Keene who wrote the Nancy Drew. So if you don't know who Carolyn Keene is, that is the pen name of the author or authors that wrote the Nancy Drew series way back when. And I'm talking like 1950s Nancy Drew, not any of this CW modern day Nancy Drew. We rebuke thee. But beside the Magic Tree House, those were the first books that I also remember reading, and I just love them. Ned Dickerson was my first book crush. Another one of my favorite authors is Richard Paul Evans, and he wrote some of my favorite books. He wrote some of my favorite romance books. I first remember reading his series called The Walk, and then I kind of just went on a rabbit hole of other books that he read, and I've been reading him ever since. Another author that I really like is Alex Grecian, and I'm not really sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, but he wrote the Yard series about Scotland Yard and detectives in Scotland Yard, coming off the back of the Jack the Ripper serial killings. And it's kind of how they dealt with the fallout of that, and also Jack does play a part in the series. But it's dark murder mystery, just right up my alley, and I love the series. Alex Grecian is one of the only authors that I've ever written to. Well, technically I emailed him, but I loved his book so much that I emailed him asking if he was going to write another one, and he actually did respond back to me. So that was really cool. If it was really him, I hope it was, but he emailed me back and said that he was planning on writing more books in the series, which he hasn't since, but I have high hopes, so I'm still waiting. So, Alex Grecian, if you're listening, please write more Scotland Yard books. I love them. Another author that I like is Tessa Wiegert, and she writes the Shanna Merchant series. And again, I'm probably butchering the names of these authors and these characters, so bear with me. But Tessa Wiegert is one of the authors that I follow the most, and I keep up to date with all her books. Another author I really like is Riley Sager. So if anyone knows Riley Sager, he's into I think it's more like psychological thriller. I don't know if he really leans into the horror stuff, like the monsters and ghosts and whatever, but he definitely is on the horror side of like deep psychological thriller side. And all his books are masterpieces. I don't think there's a book of his that I've read that I haven't liked. The first book that I read of his was Survive the Night, and I actually took it with me on vacation, but that book was so good that led me into looking up his other books, and since then I've pretty much kept up to date with Riley Sager's books. I think the last 2 times that I've been on vacation, I've brought a Riley Sager book. I like his books so much that I actually bought one of his books to read on vacation, and I usually don't buy books, I usually get them from the library, but I wasn't going to be able to get this book in time from the library, so I ended up buying it with a gift card that I had. Another author that I like is Jonathan Stroud, and Jonathan Stroud wrote the Lockwood & Co. series, and I just love that series so much. I actually only found out about the series because of the Netflix show, and so after watching the Netflix show, I read all of his books, and I loved them so much, I even read them to my sisters, and I will never forgive Netflix for canceling Lockwood & Co. So those are some of my favorite authors. I of course have so many more, but again, if I go through all of them, this would be a very lengthy podcast, and I don't want it to be too long. So I know I've talked a little bit about some of the books and the book series that I like talking about their authors, but some of my favorite book series, of course, Nancy Drew, because I started out reading those, the Shanna Merchant series by Tessa Wiegert, Any Book by Riley Sager, Lockwood & Co. series by Jonathan Stroud, the Bess Crawford series by Charles Todd, the Yard series by Alex Grecian, and the Unsub series by Meg Gardner. Which just reminds me, I forgot to talk about Meg Gardner. Meg Gardner writes the Unsub series, and that is a great murder mystery series. If you haven't read it already, I encourage you to read it. They're very good. But some of the standalone novels that I like and have read multiple times, more times than I can probably count, one of them is by Richard Paul Evans, and like I said earlier, I don't like reading romance, but this is one of the only romance books that I like. It's called The Mistletoe Promise by Richard Paul Evans. It actually is part of a series, the Mistletoe series, because everything has to do with mistletoe and they kind of do reference other books, but it's not a straight series, so they don't really reuse the characters, and it's not like a chronological series. And honestly, I only read The Mistletoe Promise. But the thing about this story that I like is that there's romance, but also touches on deep subjects. Another romance book that I like, see, I made all this hype that I don't read romance, but then I'm telling you all the romance books that I like. Anyway, the other romance book that I like is How to Find Love in a Bookstore by Veronica Henry. And this is kind of like a cast of characters books, but it also involves a bookstore, which I love bookstore books. I love books about bookstores. My dream is to have my own bookstore, but I think bookstores are a dying breed, unfortunately. So probably when I retire from being a dentist, I will work at a library, because I've also wanted to work at a library. It's weird, but I've always wanted to be the person that reshelves books. Just because I'm nosy and I like to see what people have been pulling from shelves. But even then, there's probably not a market for that job, because people probably just put the books back. I know that probably wounds every librarian all over the world, but Yeah, when I take a book out of a bookshelf, I put it back, unfortunately. And I know you're not supposed to do it because they're in a certain order. Shout out Dewey Decimal System, but I'm pretty good at remembering where books go, and you can check the number on the spine, so I just put the books back. Anyway, I digress. But How to Find Love in a Bookstore is kind of a cast of characters, so there's a main central character, but there are other characters that enhance the storyline and have their own little subplots. I don't know if it's technically considered a Christmas novel, but I usually read it around Christmas time, and it's one of the few books that I can read over and over again. Now, I know I hyped up all these books and all these authors, but the thing is for me, even if I like a book, I usually don't reread it. Like, I know there's a lot of people out there that's like, oh, this is my favorite book, I reread it all the time. I am not that kind of person. There are only a few books that I will actually recheck out of the library again. Those include the Lockwood & Co. series, The Mistletoe Promise, How to Find Love in a Bookstore, and a couple of books from Alex Grecian The Yard series. So it's the first one, and then one of the books later on, which is called The Harvest Man, because that is a really creepy book, and I do like the plot in that one. But that's not to say that I don't like these books because I don't reread them. I just don't reread the books, which is going to be hard when I have my own house and I have a library like I plan to, because I don't reread books, so there's really no purpose in me putting books on a shelf that I'm not going to read again. I know I probably offended every book lover in the world because they're like, what do you mean that you're not going to read them, and what's the use of then putting them on a bookshelf? But for me, I would only put books on a bookshelf that I would read over again. Otherwise, I just go to a library and check them out and then return them. Honestly, the only thing that would take up space in my future library would be the Nancy Drew series, because I plan on having every single one of those in my bookshelf. But maybe in the time span from now until I have my own at-home library, I will find books that I can fill the shelves with. So I know I said that I don't read a lot during the school year, but since I'm going to go on spring break, I'm planning on catching up on some reading. So obviously, I'm going to read the book that I got from my blind date with a book from my school's library, so that was Holmes, Marple, and Poe. And then I have a bunch of other books that I'm planning on reading. So one of which is The Whispers by Ashley Audrain. And so the description of this book, and I'm looking on Goodreads, is a page turner about 4 suburban families whose lives are changed when the unthinkable happens, and what is lost when good people make unconscionable choices. So I thought this was an interesting book to read, and I've read another one of Ashley Audrain's book, which is called The Push, which is also a really good book, and that's a psychological thriller, I think, or I would consider it as such. It was only because I read The Bad Seed when I was younger, and that was kind of along the vein of The Bad Seed, so I really liked that. So if you're looking for a really disturbing read, I would read The Bad Seed, and I would read The Push by Ashley Audrain. Another book that I'm planning on reading is called The Surgeon by Leslie Wolfe, and that has been on my to-read list for a long time. And I know I do have a Goodreads account, but I have never used it to track or to do like my to-read books. I've actually just put it in a OneNote notebook, and so I just have a list of books in a OneNote notebook. Again, I'm reading the synopsis from Goodreads, but it's about a surgeon, and the last part of the synopsis reads, I've never hated a patient until today, but what choice did I have once I recognized him, and what will I do to protect myself if someone learns the truth? So I thought that was pretty interesting, and I like reading kind of medical psychological thriller / horror stuff, so that sounded interesting. And again, this has been on my to read for a long time, but I've never been actually able to get it. I actually have it on hold at my library as I speak. 2 other books that I really want to read is The Chambers by Will Dean, and then Head Cases by John McMahon. The Chamber by Will Dean has also been on my to read list, and Head Cases is a book that I found on Goodreads, and unfortunately I don't think I'm going to get Head Cases in time because I'm 3rd on the hold list, so I'm probably not going to get it in time for spring break, which is unfortunate because I really like the synopsis of the book. But if I have my way, I'll read books over spring break. I tend to be a fast reader, and if it's a really good book, I could probably finish a book in 2 hours. I'm the type of reader that likes to express what I'm feeling when I'm reading the book, so especially since I read a lot of thrillers and murder mysteries, I tend to do a lot of gasping when I read, so I probably freak out some of my family because they'll just be hear like a but it's just me because I've gotten to a juicy part or like a plot twist in a book. In another life, I would probably have a book Instagram, but I just don't do enough reading to justify having a book Instagram account. But yeah, maybe one day. So if you see random posts that drop on my Instagram where it's all about books, that's me just living out my life of being a book Instagram account, but while still being in dental school. And talking about books begs a question, or something that I'm curious about. Do the people who are readers have like a special bookmark that they use? I know there's like fancy bookmarks out there that people use, but do people actually use them, or is it just like decoration? Because for me, my bookmark is an index card. I literally use an index card that you would use for like doing flashcards, and I just stick it in the book. It's cheap, I always have one on me, and I can use it for other things. But anyway, now that I've gone on a book spiel, it's time to leave y'all with some food for thought because I've since spilled the tea. Today's food for thought is to take a break. I want you to put down your school stuff and I want you to go outside, take a walk, call a friend, call your family, play with your dog, whatever, just take a break. But I think we all need a reminder of that, whether you're a dental student, a medical student, whatever. If you're working a job already, if you're in business, if you're a STEM major, just take a break. This food for thought actually comes from one of my classmates that I talked to about today. We were talking about things that we're going to do over the weekend, and I said I was probably going to study, and he said that I should take a break because I deserve it, and he was right. Everyone deserves to take a break. And that probably spurred the hot girl walk that I went on. Again, like I said, that one of the warm days I ditched the studying and actually went outside and enjoyed the sun. So that's probably where this food for thought comes from. So, long story short, make sure you take breaks. As a chronic studier, I approve that message. Well, that's all for this episode. Thank you for listening or watching or however you choose to view this. If you have questions about dental school that you want me to answer or a topic that you want me to talk about, please ask away, either DM me on Instagram or send a carrier pigeon my way. I'm more than happy to answer them for you. That's all for this episode. I'll see you in the next one.